from PRI, Public Radio International, and WGBH Radio Boston.
On a wall of a bedroom on the second floor of the White House hangs a painting. It's a night scene, painted with dark colors. Inside a rough-hewn log cabin, a group of men, women, and children, tense and expectant. By the light of a torch held high by a tall man with an iron collar around his neck, they gather around an elderly man bent over a table, holding a pocket watch in one hand. His other hand rests on a Bible. A dozen pair of eyes are fixed on the hands of the pocket watch. It's just 5 minutes before midnight. They are waiting for the hour, waiting for midnight and the new year. Below the painting is a desk, the Lincoln desk, the one on which he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The people in the painting are enslaved African Americans, waiting for the hour of their freedom. Boston-born artist William Tolman Carlton titled his painting Watch Service, December 31, 1862, Waiting for the Hour. It was commemorating the vigils that took place on that night as an enslaved people waited to hear if President Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. They watched and prayed, hoping that the hour of their freedom had come at last. The story of this painting, what it represents, and how it got to the White House traces significant themes in American history: race, religion, and the struggle for freedom. It's a story that bridges the old world and the new, and links many strands of our religious and cultural heritage. Most of all, it's a story with a living tradition, Watch Night, a tradition whose impact is growing in our own time. I'm Howard Powell. You may know about Watch Night, especially if you grew up in one of the many African American religious communities where people gather at the church on New Year's Eve to sing and pray the old year out and welcome the new one in. And there's no shortage of information about the vigil. The web has plenty of references, many pinpointing its origins to those gatherings of slaves waiting for midnight on December 31st, 1862. It's a good story, and it's taken on the qualities of a good urban legend. Like many such legends, this one has some truth in it. But there's a lot more to the story, and the reality enlarges and enriches the narrative. The Emancipation Proclamation does play an important part, but it's not the origin of the tradition. In fact, Watch Night, as it is celebrated today, has deep roots that go back to the old world, to Europe, and to Africa. It's a tradition that grew stronger and richer as communities in the New World celebrated and brought their experience to the Watch Night Vigil. And it's a tradition that's still alive and vital, a celebration with a future. The first late-night prayer services, known as Watch Nights, were held in Germany in the 1730s by a people we know as Moravians, Protestant religious refugees fleeing persecution in their Central European homeland. These Unitas Fratrum, or United Brethren, sought to discern the nature of the divine will and then establish a true loving community, just as close as they could come to original Christianity, a piece of heaven on earth. In necessariis unitas, in dubiis libertas, in omnibus caritas. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all, love. That was their motto, and still is. Like so many other religious groups seeking freedom to worship in peace and follow their spiritual vision, the Moravians joined the migrations to America. Their first attempts in Georgia didn't work out, but subsequent settlements in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and in Salem, North Carolina were successful. They are still there today, celebrating watch nights and Christian love feasts, with hymns, prayers, and wonderful instrumental music. But Watch Night doesn't seem to have entered the African American tradition through direct contact with the Moravians.
Down in the wilderness. I know it's among the Methodists.
Yes, to paraphrase the old spiritual, it was among the Methodists that Watch Night spread across the colonies and eventually became a part of the African American religious tradition. And the complex story of how that came to be begins with John Wesley and the birth of Methodism.
Why don't you stop your telling lies?
In the early 1720s, John Wesley was at Oxford studying to become an Anglican priest. But as he pursued his calling, he began a very personal search for the deep religious experience he felt would give meaning to his life. He wasn't satisfied with what he called the dry, formal, crusty orthodoxy of conventional religious observances. He wanted something more, something that moved him and brought him in touch with God. He was looking for a real spirituality to underlie and support his religion. In 1735, he traveled as a missionary and minister to the Georgia colony. While his ministry there didn't go well, the trip wasn't a total loss, for on the way over he met some Moravians aboard ship. During a violent storm at sea, while the other passengers were screaming and running about in all directions, Wesley observed the Moravians confidently singing hymns in the face of danger. He was deeply impressed by their calm assurance, and when he got back to London, he joined up with a band of Moravians who'd settled in England. He attended their watch nights, study groups, love feasts, and worship services. And it was at one of their meetings that John Wesley felt his heart strangely warmed, and he had the deeply moving spiritual experience for which he'd yearned for years. Over time, however, John Wesley had his differences with the London Moravians, and late in 1739, he and a group of like-minded associates left and formed the religious movement that would eventually lead to the founding of the Methodist way of life and worship. Early Methodism was an itinerant movement, often preached outdoors, since the established church was disturbed by what it saw as innovation and perhaps heresy, and denied the use of church buildings. So Methodists spoke and preached wherever crowds would gather, and when the itinerant ministers moved on, groups of lay people would continue meeting, and the movement grew. In Bristol, in a swelling enthusiasm for the Methodist spirit of renewal, mine workers began holding late-night religious services on the weekend rather than going drinking at the pubs. While some objected to the gatherings, John Wesley had experienced the watch night services of the Moravians, and he also associated the coal miners' meetings with the early Christian practice of all-night prayer vigils. With these two powerful ideas of renewal and communal worship in mind, Wesley made watch nights a part of Methodist practice and discipline. His brother Charles wrote hymns for watch night, which they published in London in the mid-1740s.
Come, let us anew our pleasures pursue. For Christian delight the day is too short, let us borrow the night. In sanctified joy each moment employ to Jesus' praise, and spend and be spent in the triumph of grace. Our concert of praise to Jesus we raise, and all the night long continue the new evangelical song. We dance to the fame of Jesus' name. The joy it imparts is heaven begun in our musical hearts.
At first, the Friday nights closest to the full moon were set aside for the late-night meetings. Then they became quarterly, and finally coalesced with the annual covenant renewal service. Since then, watch night services have been held on New Year's Eve. Again, Charles Wesley wrote hymns for the occasion, changing the words to suit the new calendar.
Come, let us anew our journey pursue, roll round with the year, and never stand still till the Master appear. His adorable will let us gladly fulfill, and our talents improve by the patience of hope and the labor of love. Our life is a dream, our time as a stream glides swiftly away, and the fugitive moment refuses to stay. The arrow is flown, the moment is gone. The millennial year rushes on to our view, and eternity's here.
Amen.
a New Year's hymn by Charles Wesley for the Watch Night service. Our contemporary Watch Night has its roots in the Old World and comes to us from the Methodists and the Moravians thanks to John Wesley. But Methodist Anglicans celebrating a New Year's vigil in England is still a long way from late-night religious services held by African Americans in the United States. That connection and the vigil's association with Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation is the next part of our Watch Night story. If you'd like to see some pages from the Wesley Brothers pamphlet of Watch Night hymns, or want to see the Watch Night painting that hangs over the Lincoln desk in the White House, you can go to our website at wgbh.org/watchnight. There you'll find these and other interesting pieces of the Watch Night tradition. That's wgbh.org/watchnight. You're listening to Watch Night from PRI, Public Radio International. I'm Howard Powell, and this is Watch Night, the story of the New Year's vigil held in African American churches to commemorate Freedom's Eve, that late December night in 1862 when people watched and waited to hear if President Lincoln would issue the Emancipation Proclamation on New Year's Day. So far, we've traced the European origins of the Watch Night service, from the Moravians to the Methodists in England. But where did Watch Night come from in America? And how did it enter the African American tradition? Methodism began in England as a spiritual movement within the Anglican Church. John Wesley didn't want to start his own denomination. It was in America that Methodism organized as a church. The ideals and aspirations of the American Revolution implied a separation and freedom from the Church of England and its king. Though a loyal subject of the British monarch, Wesley understood that in the new land, a new religious opportunity had opened up. He thought that divine providences would allow the Methodist religious movement to develop away from the close control of the established Church of England. In the years leading up to the American Revolution, Wesley sent some of his associates to the colonies as missionaries. In Philadelphia, they met up with one of the early Methodists from Bristol. Soon the movement found a group of vigorous followers in that city, and in 1769, they established Old St. George's Church, a graceful building still in use known as the cradle of American Methodism. 1 year later, in 1770, their minister, James Pillmore, held the Methodist first Watch Nights in America. If you visit the church today, you can still see treasured artifacts from those early days. There are other notable firsts associated with Old St. George's. The church was the first to engage an African American as a Methodist minister. Since Wesley was adamantly opposed to slavery and early Methodism thoroughly abolitionist in its outlook, Old St. George's was attractive to the large African American population in Philadelphia, enslaved and free. In 1786, Richard Allen, a former slave, was licensed to preach and minister to African Americans in Philadelphia. the St. George's congregation grew and came to have a significant black attendance. Unfortunately, racism, endemic in American culture at large, was present in the congregation too. Allen had to preach at 5 a.m., and at other services, the blacks sat in the back or worse. Richard Allen tells the story in his autobiography.
When the colored people began to get numerous in attending the church, they moved us from the seats we usually sat on and placed us around the wall. And on Sabbath morning we went to church, and the sexton stood at the door and told us to go in the gallery. He told us to go, and we would see where to sit. We expected to take the seats over the ones we formerly occupied below, not knowing any better. We took those seats. Meeting had begun, and they were nearly done singing, and just as we got to the seats, the elder said, "Let us pray." We had not been long upon our knees before I heard considerable scuffling and low talking. I raised my head up and saw one of the trustees having hold of Absalom Jones, pulling him up off of his knees and saying, "You must get up. You must not kneel here." Mr. Jones replied, "Wait until prayer is over." "No, you must get up now, or I will call for aid and force you away." Mr. Jones said, "Wait until prayer is over, and I will get up and trouble you no more." With that, the trustee beckoned to one of the others to come to his assistance. He came and went to William White to pull him up. By this time, prayer was over, and we all went out of the church in a body, and they were no more plagued with us in the church.
No longer feeling welcomed at their home church, Richard Allen and his associates left their congregation and eventually formed the first African Methodist Episcopal Church. It's known as Mother Bethel AME Church, located just 8 blocks away from Old St. George's. Allen still considered himself a part of the Methodist movement. He took Wesley's Methodist discipline, hymns, and spiritual traditions along with him. While the AME Church later organized as a separate denomination, Watch Night, scheduled on New Year's Eve, was retained as part of AME religious practice and remains so today.
Did my Lord deliver Daniel and mine every night?
Did my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Did my Lord deliver Daniel, and why not every man? Did my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Did my Lord deliver Daniel, and why not every man? He delivered Daniel from the lion's den, Jonah from the belly of the whale, and the Hebrew children from the fiery furnace, and why not every man? Did my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Did my Lord deliver Daniel, and why not every man? The wind blows east and the wind blows west, it blows like the judgment day, and every poor soul that never did pray would be glad to pray that day. Did my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Did my Lord deliver Daniel, and why not every man? I set my foot on the gospel ship, and the ship it began to sail. It landed me over in Canaan shore, and I'll never come back anymore. Did my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Did my Lord, and why not every man?
And why not every man?
Then why?
Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Why not every man? A spiritual that expresses the deep irony and contradictions at the heart of slavery. Before the actual guns and blood of the Civil War, Americans engaged in a long, bitter, spiritual and cultural war over that peculiar institution called by some America's original sin. In the New World, slavery was abolished piecemeal, one part at a time. The transatlantic slave trade was outlawed, but the enslavement of African Americans continued, and the young nation had to work out the consequences. The abolition of slavery in the United States of America became a great moral and political cause for many, and an economic question as well. The states came down on different sides of the issue. As the nation grew, so did the problem. In a 1783 lawsuit brought by an enslaved African American, Massachusetts acknowledged that its 1780 state constitution effectively outlawed slavery. Over time, the New England region became a hotbed of abolitionist activism. Religion, and Methodism in particular, provided theology, moral reasoning, and tradition that the abolitionists used to pursue their cause. One of Charles Wesley's hymns for Watch Night became an anthem of the movement, the one titled The Year of Jubilee, better known by its opening line, "Blow ye the trumpet, blow." Americans really took to that hymn. They sang it with great fervor to their own homegrown tunes.
Blow ye the trumpet, blow that gladly solemn sound. Let all the nations know to earth's remotest bound. The year of Jubilee is come, the year of Jubilee is come. Return ye ransomed sinners home. Ye slaves of
Blow ye the trumpet, blow, or the Year of Jubilee. African Americans sang this hymn in their churches, on the plantation, and even in fiction. You'll find it in Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was John Brown's favorite hymn, sung at his funeral. William Lloyd Garrison printed it in The Liberator, his abolitionist newspaper. The Hutchinsons, a family of traveling minstrel superstars from New Hampshire, sang it to open the annual meeting of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society in 1843. The concept of Jubilee spoke to the heart of the abolitionist movement because the Bible required that in the year of Jubilee, all land be allowed to rest and be returned to its original family ownership. And most important, that slaves were to be freed. No wonder the abolitionists made this rousing watch night hymn their theme song. They were working, watching, and waiting for the year of Jubilee.
ye slaves of sin and hell, your liberty receive, and safe in Jesus dwell, and blessed in Jesus live. The year of Jubilee is come, the year of Jubilee is come. Return ye ransomed sinners home. The gospel trumpet hear, the news of heavenly grace, and safe from earth appear before your Savior's face. The year of Jubilee is come, the year of Jubilee is come. Return ye ransomed sinners home.
If you'd like to see some of the other abolitionist songs and hymns, or want to see the Watch Night painting that hangs over the Lincoln desk in the White House, you can go to our website at wgbh.org/watchnight. There you'll find these and other interesting aspects of the Watch Night tradition. That's wgbh.org/watchnight. You're listening to Watch Night from PRI, Public Radio International. I'm Howard Powell, and this is Watch Night. When the Civil War started, slavery wasn't at the heart of the conflict for many Americans. Abraham Lincoln framed the issue as preserving the Union. But as the war proceeded, Lincoln became persuaded that the slavery issue was pivotal. After much deliberation, and with more than 3 months' notice, the president issued a threat. He signaled his intent to emancipate the slaves held by the rebel Confederate states on January 1st, 1863. This provoked vigorous discussion among Northerners, abolitionists, and otherwise. In his autobiography, Unitarian minister Moncure Daniel Conway explains that the advance warning had the effect of giving the Border Seceders time to dispose of their slaves farther south, and it also gave time for an outcry of their sympathizers that the president meant to excite a massacre of whites in the South. These fears convinced some that the emancipation would not be a good thing, and they brought increasing pressure on the president to retreat from the proclamation. In the preliminary version, there were clauses making such a retreat possible. On the other side, anti-slavery activists brought to bear on the administration whatever influence they had in order to hold the president to his pledge. As the year drew toward its close, expectation and anticipation rose to extraordinary heights. On December 31st, 1862, groups of anxious people, black and white, enslaved and free, gathered to wait for word of what Lincoln would do. In Boston, African Americans packed their meeting house on Joy Street for the traditional Watch Night service. Moncure Conway and a few staunch abolitionist friends went out late that night to join them in their vigil.
On the eve of New Year's Day, 1863, we made up a little party to attend Watch Night in the African church. Young William Lloyd Garrison and his sister Fanny were with us. We arrived about 11:30, and though the church was much crowded, the Garrisons were recognized and good places found for us, the only whites present. In opening the meeting, the black preacher said, "Brethren and sisters, the President of the United States has promised that if the Confederates do not lay down their arms, he will free all their slaves tomorrow. They have not laid down their arms. Tomorrow will be the day of liberty to the oppressed. But we all know that evil powers are around the President. While we sit here, they are trying to make him break his word. But we have come this watch night to watch and see that he does not break his word. Brethren, the bad influence near the President tonight is strong. The old serpent is abroad tonight with all his emissaries in great power. His wrath is great because he knows his hour is near. He will be in this church this evening. As midnight comes on, we shall hear his rage. But brethren and sisters, don't be alarmed. Our prayers will prevail. His head will be bruised. His back will be broke. He will go raging back to hell. And God Almighty's New Year will make the United States a true land of freedom." The sensation caused by these words was profound. They were interrupted by frequent cries of "Glory!" and there were tears of joy. But the excitement that followed was indescribable. A few minutes before midnight, the congregation were requested to kneel, which we all did, and prayer succeeded prayer with increasing fervor and amid shouts of rapture. Presently a loud, prolonged hiss was heard. There were cries, "He's here! He's here!" Then came a volley of hisses. They proceeded from every part of the house, hisses so entirely like those of huge serpents that the strongest nerves were shaken. Above them rose the preacher's prayer, gradually becoming a wild incantation, and ecstatic ejaculations became so universal that it was a marvel what voices were left to make the hisses. Finally, the strokes of midnight sounded, and immediately the hisses diminished and gradually died away, as if outside the building. Then the new year of Jubilee that was to bring freedom to millions of slaves was ushered in by the chorus of all present, singing a hymn of victory. The hymn was the old Methodist Year of Jubilee, which I had so many years heard sung in Virginia by the Negroes when their night was without any star, save that burning in their faith. Blow ye the trumpet, blow the gladly solemn sound. Let all the nations know, to earth's remotest bound, the year of Jubilee is come. Return, ye ransomed sinners, home. We all joined hands, standing up, and sang with ecstasy until our voices broke with the overpowering emotion.
If they trumpet blow, they gladly solemn sound. Let all the nation know, to every word is found. The year of Jubilee, the year of Jubilee is come, returning ransom saints home. The year of Jubilee, the year of Jubilee is come, returning ransom saints home. Thank you.
Similar gatherings took place across the country, praying, singing, and waiting for the hour of emancipation. But would it actually arrive? Had Lincoln enacted his proclamation? The next morning, New Year's Day, everyone waited to receive the news. For the black abolitionist leader, Frederick Douglass, at the movement's epicenter in Boston, it was an exhilarating but anxious moment. An immense assembly convened in Tremont Temple, Douglass wrote, to receive and celebrate the first utterance of the long-hoped-for proclamation, if it came. And if it did not come, to speak our minds freely. For, in view of the past, it was by no means certain that it would come. Every moment of waiting chilled our hopes and strengthened our fears. A line of messengers was established between the telegraph office and the platform of Tremont Temple. 8, 9, 10 o'clock came and went, and still no word. At last, a man advanced through the crowd and exclaimed in tones that thrilled all hearts, "It is coming! It is on the wires!" The effect of this announcement was startling beyond description, and the scene was wild and grand. Joy and gladness exhausted all forms of expression, from shouts of praise to sobs and tears. The Emancipation Proclamation had been signed by the president. Down the street at the Boston Music Hall, Ralph Waldo Emerson delivered the Boston Hymn, his rousing response to Lincoln's proclamation. And back at the Tremont Temple, Frederick Douglass led yet another ecstatic rendition of Charles Wesley's Watch Night Hymn.
Blow ye the trumpet, blow the gladly solemn sound. Blow ye the trumpets, blow the gladly solemn sound. Let all the nations know, to earth's remotest bounds, the year of Jubilee is come, the year of Jubilee is come. Jubilee is come, the year of Jubilee is come, return and some sinners home.
Perhaps the words of Wesley's hymn are overly optimistic. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually free the slaves. It freed some of them, but it only applied to the Confederate states, and indeed only to the parts of the states not under Union control. Enslaved African Americans in the rest of the country, and there were many, were not covered by Lincoln's proclamation. The year of Jubilee hadn't really come. There was still work of emancipation to do.
I will wish that I knew how it feels to be free. I wish I could break all these chains binding me. I wish I could say all the things I should say. Say 'em loud, say 'em clear, for the whole world to hear.
William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist, ardent and implacable, was unsure of Lincoln. Would the president follow through and finish the work uprooting slavery for good? Garrison met with Lincoln at the Republican National Convention in Baltimore in early June 1864. They spoke about ending slavery once and for all. He came away convinced that Lincoln would follow through and do the right thing. Eventually, sooner rather than later, all enslaved Americans would be freed. Garrison went back to Boston to raise money to purchase a new oil painting by William Tolman Carleton. Watch service, December 31, 1862, Waiting for the Hour. That's the painting we described at the beginning of this program. It was presented to President Lincoln and today hangs in the White House over the Lincoln desk.
Keep your lamps trimmed and burning. Keep your lamps trimmed and burning. Keep your lamps trimmed and burning. The time is drawing nigh.
After the Emancipation Proclamation, people continued to celebrate Watch Night. In African American churches in particular, the vigil held new significance and deep meaning. It's called Freedom's Eve in commemoration of that 1862 Watch Night. But for others, Watch Night took on a lower profile, its historical connection fading with time. It wasn't lost, though. As recently as the 1970s, folk music collectors recorded an unbroken tradition of a Watch Night shout in the Georgia Sea Islands, a living tradition with roots going back into times of slavery and possibly even back to Africa.
So I'm going to sing one of the slave songs that they like to sing. This after they come out of slave, they sing this song, Jubilee in the morning. Jubilee, Jubilee.
Oh, my Lord.
Jubilee in the morning.
My Lord, Jubilee.
Jubilee in the evening.
Oh, my Lord.
Jubilee in the morning.
My Lord, Jubilee.
Jubilee, Jubilee.
Oh, my Lord.
Jubilee, Jubilee.
My Lord, Jubilee.
Walking, man was walking.
Oh, my Lord.
Walking on your Jesus.
My Lord, Jubilee.
Shout, my children, 'cause you're free.
Oh, my Lord.
My God brought you liberty.
My Lord, Jubilee.
Call me a Sunday Christian.
Oh, my Lord.
Call me a Monday devil.
My Lord, Jubilee.
Don't care what you call me.
Oh, my Lord.
So long Jesus love me.
My Lord, Jubilee.
Jubilee, Jubilee.
Oh, my Lord.
Jubilee, Jubilee.
My Lord, Jubilee.
Walking man was walking.
Oh, my Lord.
Walking on your Jesus.
My Lord, Jubilee.
Shout, my children, 'cause you're free.
Oh, my Lord.
My God brought you liberty.
Oh, Lord, Jubilee.
Jubilee, Jubilee.
Oh, my Lord.
Jubilee in the morning.
My Lord, Jubilee.
Jubilee in the evening.
Oh, my Lord.
Jubilee in the morning.
My Lord, Jubilee.
Call me a Sunday Christian.
Oh, my Lord.
Call me a Monday devil.
Oh, Lord, Jubilee.
Don't care what you call me.
Watch Night is a tradition that continues today. It got a real boost as we entered a new millennium. Now you can read about it in newspapers and on the internet. Watch Night lives, but has the promise of Jubilee been realized? In ancient biblical tradition, the Jubilee promises that all oppressed people will receive their freedom and a fair share of the resources they need to live their lives. But freedom in America has come slowly. Even a century after the Emancipation Proclamation, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King could stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and say,
100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land.
Much has happened since 1963. But even now, almost 50 years later, can we say that we are finished with the work? Have we realized the dream? Has the year of Jubilee come yet? The Reverend Irene Monroe.
The work is not finished, but what we have done is realize the transforming potential of the dream. Watch night services hold important significance in the life of African American churchgoers because it's about creating a new life in the new year. As a child who grew up in the tradition, there was always that mad rush every December 31st to clean the house, cook a pot of black-eyed peas for good luck, and call folks to tell them, if God wills it, you'll see them in the new year. During watch night service, the minister would always remind us of the trials and tribulations of the year we were about to leave behind. But the minister would also tell us that the new year was the first day of new beginnings, just like our enslaved ancestors saw it. And at every service I attended as a child, when the clock struck midnight, the people applauded, cried, danced, and sang. What hope and inspiration it was to know that in spite of the year just lived, especially if it was fraught with pain, violence, and tragedy, a new year comes in which we can free ourselves from the year past. I came to understand that watch night services extend themselves to everyone, not just African Americans, but to people of all races and ethnicities, of all sexual orientations, of all religions and cultures. Why? Because watch night services are about what concerns all people, and that is justice, personal healing, and celebration. Watch night reminds us that when the work of justice is bent towards freedom, it allows us to see the faces and to hear the voices of those dispossessed, disinherited, disrespected, and damned by society. It's at the margins where we can see injustice being done, and that's the place where our work must begin in order to create a multicultural society so that no one is left behind and every voice is lifted up. As an African American lesbian minister, I know that the struggle against racism is only legitimate if I'm also fighting anti-Semitism, anti-Islamism, homophobia, sexism, and classism together. If we act as if one oppression, our oppression, is greater than another person's oppression, we only set up a hierarchy of oppressions, which not only keeps us broken, it also keeps us fighting. It chokes the spiritual life of a people and derails our efforts towards a common goal. Watch Night reminds us about personal healing and living in a space of thankfulness. As Americans, we are a wounded people. One of the ways we heal our woundedness is to live in a space of thankfulness. When you're in a space of thankfulness, you count your blessings. You consciously and concretely build a life of gratitude. This is not a denial of the adversity, hardship, and suffering that goes on in our lives and in the world, but rather, it is an understanding that there are lessons to be learned in those moments. They not only bring us closer to God, but they also bring us closer to one another. And lastly, Watch Night reminds us about creativity and celebration. Creativity plays a vital role in the life and courage of all people, and Watch Night services allow us to create our freedom, although we know it won't come easily. We need to work to rediscover what freedom means and how to achieve it. And it involves our recommitment to the struggle for justice. But freedom isn't all drudgery and work. It's about worshiping, praying, dancing, singing, and laughing together. Watch Night, a celebration we can all share together. It allows us to cross over into a new year, one that gives us creative hope, agency, and courage to build the world we want to live in.
The Reverend Irene Monroe is a public theologian, a religion columnist and minister, and a teaching fellow at Harvard Divinity School. If you'd like to read more of what she has to say, you'll find it on our website, wgbh.org/watchnight. There you'll find information about the music you've heard, web links, and other interesting pieces of our research. You can also listen to the program again if you'd like. That's wgbh.org/watchnight. So Watch Night isn't lost, and it's not just a museum piece. It's a living tradition filled with the themes of Jubilee: human freedom, economic justice, social equality, family and community ties, interconnectedness and ecological care, perennial values and concerns for all. We can still hold a true Watch Night vigil, not merely a celebration of the past, but a real looking forward to the future, its promise, and our responsibilities. The as yet to be fulfilled promise of the American dream, liberty and justice for all. It's an ideal we can all embrace.
Watch Night is a production of WGBH Radio Boston. The program was conceived, researched, and written by Jeffrey Nelson. The narrator was Howard Powell. Our recording and mix engineer was Jane Pippick, with additional engineering by Alan Mattis, Robin Moore, and Ray Fallon. Character speaking parts were by Richard Knisley and Roberto Maiti. Special thanks to the Reverend Irene Monroe for her contribution to the program. Our musicians for the performance of The Year of Jubilee were the Revels Repertory Company, directed by Kay Dunlap. The part of Frederick Douglass was sung by baritone Milton Wright. The theme music was arranged by James Johnston and performed by Cameron Kirkpatrick, oboe, and Kathy Fuller, piano. Watch Night was produced by Jeffrey Nelson. The executive producer was John Solons. Special thanks to Andrea Rule and the many other people who helped make this program possible. You can find out more about them at our website, wgbh.org/watchnight, where you can also listen to this program again. In addition, there's a lot more information about Watch Night, including excerpts from our research and a photograph of the picture that hangs over the Lincoln desk in the White House, all available at our website, wgbh.org/watchnight. Support for this program comes from this station and Public Radio International stations nationwide, and is made possible in part by the PRI Program Fund, whose contributors include the Ford Foundation and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation.
PRI, Public Radio International.